Chapter 2. Orinoco and the Black Umbrella. You have already watched the film or the television programme of Orinoco and the Black Umbrella. So let's listen to the story from the book and we will see what is the same and what is different. Good morning, said Bungo, putting his nose round the workshop door. You're late, said Tobermory, looking at the shelf which held the clocks and watches. As he had got most of them in working order and wound them up, they made a busy ticking noise, like dozens of pecking birds. I overslept, said Bungo. He hadn't got used to being a working Womble yet, and in the evenings he was often so tired that he couldn't keep his eyes open, and he would nod off with his head on another Womble's shoulder, lulled by the steady rumble of voices. For if there is one thing that Wombles are really fond of, it's the sound of their own voices. And there was a great deal to discuss at the moment, with Christmas only 2 months away, and after that the planning of the great Womble outing. Midsummer's Eve is the most important night of the year, as far as the Wimbledon Wombles are concerned. They have a tremendous party, and it takes a great deal of organising. So it just goes to show how tired Bungo must have been to go to sleep while all of that was being discussed. Perhaps Tobermory understood, for after a quick glance at Bungo, he only said, "Well, off you go then, and remember to keep your back paws firmly on the ground." "Why?" asked Bungo. "Wait and see," said Tobermory, and began putting a camera together on his workbench, his paws neatly and carefully picking up each tiny screw and examining it through a jeweller's glass which he had fixed into his eye. It didn't take Bungo long to discover what Tobermory had meant, for the moment the main door of the burrow was opened, he was nearly blown backwards by the wind. Small dry leaves and dust and tiny scraps of paper whirled past his head, and his fur was quite flattened. "Whoops," said Bungo, dragging the door shut behind him and leaning against it. He had never been out in a gale before, and high wind is dangerous to small Wombles and can blow them clean off their paws. Bungo turned his back on it and felt his eyes watering as he worked his way through the bushes, while all the time twigs and leaves were rattling about his head, and the trees up above were bending and creaking and throwing their branches about. "Thought you were never coming," said Orinoco, who had made himself comfortable in amongst the bushes. "Well, there's a lot of work to be done." And there was, for the wind had driven across the streets and gardens of southwest London before it reached the common, and on its journey it had picked up everything in its path. There were newspapers and paper bags, handkerchiefs and hats, scarves and gloves, bus tickets and shopping lists and notes left for the milkman, and a lot more besides, all scudding happily across the grass and through the bushes. Orinoco had already found a scarf, red and white stripes, and had wrapped it around and around his neck and then over his straw hat to keep it in place. "We'll never tidy up all of this," said Bungo in dismay. "Got to try," said Orinoco. "I've made a start." And he twitched at the scarf. "Now, off you go, young Bungo, while I get my breath back." And he settled down and shut his eyes. For the next hour, Bungo trotted backwards and forwards, chasing the papers and stuffing them into his shopping basket. But as soon as he had cleared one patch of the common, the wind sent another shoal of bits and pieces dancing through the air. In spite of the cold, it was a north wind. Bungo was very soon warm indeed. So he wedged his basket firmly between 2 tree stumps and went puffing and panting down to Queensmere to have a drink of water. There was nobody about apart from the ducks, and Bungo stopped to watch them riding on the water. which was quite choppy and full of leaves. He was just thinking about going back to work when he noticed something long and black caught in the rushes. And although the pond was not one of the places which he had to keep tidy, being Bungo, he couldn't resist going to have a closer look. So he slid into the water and swam across. "It's a stick with stuff on it," said Bungo, circling round the thing. One of the ducks came quacking over, and Bungo slapped the water with its paws, and the duck sailed away again. "Silly thing," said Bungo, who, like most Wombles, didn't think much of ducks, rabbits and squirrels. He got hold of the long black thing between his teeth and pulled it free and began to swim back to the shore rather slowly, for the object was large and awkward. Once on firm ground, Bungo put it down and shook himself thoroughly, and then put the thing under his arm, collected his shopping basket and hurried off to Orinoco. Orinoco was sound asleep, but he woke up at once when he heard Bungo and sat up and pretended to be very busy looking through the 3 bus tickets in his tidy bag. "Look what I've found," said Bungo, laying the thing at Orinoco's paws. "That's nothing to get excited about. It's only an old umbrella," said Orinoco. Now, Bungo was a good-hearted Womble who would never do anyone a bad turn, but it did occur to him at this moment that it was rather unfair that he should work so hard while Orinoco hardly did a paw's turn. Perhaps it was because Orinoco was being so squashing about the umbrella. "It's a very splendid umbrella," Bungo said. He had actually never seen one before, because he hadn't yet been all round the workshop, where, as it happened, Tobermory had a very good selection of umbrellas, and even a couple of parasols. "Look!" And he picked it up and twirled it round and round his head in exactly the same way as Great Uncle Bulgaria twirled his stick sometimes. "That's not the way to use it," said Orinoco, and he got up out of his nest and took the umbrella from Bungo's paws and opened it up. Now, although Orinoco was quite fat, no Womble is what you might call thin, but Orinoco was fatter than most. The wind was exceptionally strong, and the umbrella particularly large, and before Orinoco or Bungo quite knew what was happening, Orinoco was being swept up over the grass as fast as his short legs would carry him. Hang on, said Bungo, dancing up and down. "I am hanging on," Orinoco shouted back, for a Womble, once it's attached to something, simply will not let go. He was on the top of a high ridge of ground by this time, and suddenly the wind lifted him clean off his paws and took him straight upwards to the sky. "Come back!" shouted Bungo. "I can't!" shouted Orinoco. Up and up he went, peering over his shoulder at the ground, which was now spreading out beneath him, so that he could see the tops of the tossing trees and the ruffled water of Queensmere. And beyond that, there was the windmill and the golf course, and beyond that, the road to one side of the common, with the early morning rush hour traffic just starting to build up. He could even see the roofs of houses and a building site where the workmen were coming on duty. He only needed to go a little bit higher, and he might have been able to see the dome of St. Paul's far away to the east. Orinoco gave a dreadful groan and gripped the umbrella handle harder than ever. Because of his fatness, he had stopped climbing trees some time ago, and he had rather lost his head for heights, and in any case, this was a great deal higher than any Womble had ever been before. If he could have gone green with fright and air sickness, Orinoco would have done. But as it was, all he could do was to groan. Far, far below, Bungo was nearly as worried as Orinoco. Supposing he was blown right over London? Supposing he hit some tall trees or a building, or got caught in some wires? Supposing he was never seen again? All kinds of dreadful ideas went through Bungo's mind as he ran, puffing and panting over the grass, trying to keep up with Orinoco's progress through the sky. It was the umbrella which had started all the trouble, and that put an end to the awful journey. It had never been made to be blown through the air with a fat womble hanging on to it, and quite suddenly there was a horrible creaking sound above Orinoco's head, and as he looked up, he saw the umbrella shiver and shake, and then there was a ripping noise, and all the spokes rushed upwards, and the umbrella turned itself inside out. It was Orinoco's good fortune that it chose to do this just as they scudded over Queensmere. "Yow!" yelled Orinoco. The air rushed past him, flattening his fur, and he began to fall faster and faster until there was a whistling sound in his ears. "Yow!" roared Orinoco and shut his eyes, and the next moment he hit the lake with a tremendous smack, sending up a great shower of water and making every duck swim for cover as hard as it could go. Down and down went Orinoco right to the muddy bottom. And then, with his head whirling and his mouth, which had been open at the time, full of weeds, he rose slowly to the surface, the umbrella still tightly grasped between his paws. "I'm coming!" panted Bungo, sliding and slipping down the steep bank, and he dived into the mere for the second time that morning. Orinoco rolled over onto his back and lay quite still with his eyes closed. His paws crossed over his stomach, the umbrella held between them. "I've caught you!" puffed Bungo, fighting his way through the ripples, for Orinoco's fall had set up a widening circle of tidal waves, which were now splashing onto the ground. And he put his paws over Orinoco's ears and began to pull him towards dry land, paddling as hard as he could go. Orinoco, as stiff as a poker, was hauled, wet and extremely muddy, on to the path. "Are you dead?" Bungo asked anxiously. "Yes," said Orinoco in a feeble voice, without opening his eyes. "Oh dear," said Bungo. "Very, very nearly dead, anyway," said Orinoco, opening one eye a little. "What are you laughing at? Being nearly dead is not funny at all." "No, rather not," said Bungo, snuffling behind his paw. "When I think of what I've been through," said Orinoco, opening the other eye and looking sternly at the quivering Bungo, "I expect sympathy, not giggling. If you only knew what it was like." And he shivered violently. "I'm sorry, truly I am," said Bungo, putting both paws over his mouth. "But all the same, Orinoco, if you only knew what you look like with weeds in your fur, and your hat's gone very peculiar." "My hat," said Orinoco weakly, and sat up. Instead of a boater, he was now wearing what looked like a bonnet, for the straw had gone all soggy, and what with that, and the mud, and the weeds, and the relief, Bungo could contain himself no longer, and he flopped down onto the ground and laughed until his stomach ached and the tears squeezed out of his eyes. "If only you knew what you looked like," Bungo said wheezily, flying through the air and groaning and moaning, and then zip, bang, crash, wallop down into the water, and then bubble, bubble, slosh, bosh, up again, and now, ha 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 ha. "I don't think it's at all funny," said Orinoco coldly. "Not funny in the least little tiny bit." Oh no, rather not," said Bungo, flapping his paws feebly. "Not funny at all, really." Orinoco rose with great dignity and went down to the water's edge and took off his scarf and wrung it out. And then he shook his hat, which would never be the same again. And then he cleaned his fur and shook himself. And finally he picked up the umbrella, and still without a word, and with his nose in the air, he led the way back to their patch of the common, with Bungo still snorting and sniffing, trotting along behind him. At last Orinoco spoke. "I'm worn out," he said, absolutely exhausted. What I need is a good 40 winks. And he began to flatten out his little nest in the bushes. Bungo looked at him, and then at the umbrella, and then at Orinoco's very nearly empty tidy bag, and finally at the patch which they were supposed to keep tidy, and which was now covered again with newspapers and bus tickets and even some rusty old tins. "No, you don't," said Bungo daringly. "What you need is something to warm you up, like work." Orinoco stopped nest making and looked at Bungo over his shoulder. "Dalmatian dogs," Orinoco said. "Black umbrellas, zick bang crash wallop," said Bungo. There was a long silence, which was only broken by the roar of the wind and the rattling of the trees. And then, very, very slowly, Orinoco straightened up and shook his head sadly. "All right, young Bungo, very well, but just this once, that's all." When Tobermory saw the umbrella, he shook his head over it and said, and put it on the end of his workbench to be mended later. "Haven't got time to attend to it at the moment," he said. "It's been a very busy day." And indeed, the usually neat workshop had mounds and mounds of things all over the floor, and a number of Wombles were hard at work sorting through the piles. "I hope you managed to keep your paws on the ground all right," said Tobermory as Bungo reached the door. "Oh, rather," said Bungo. "I didn't have any trouble at all." And he went off, whistling, and with such a wide smile on his face that Tobermory spent at least 10 seconds scratching his head and wondering what he had been up to. And as Bungo was, after all, a very good-hearted Womble, he never mentioned the umbrella to Orinoco again. Unfortunately, Orinoco was not cured of his laziness. It would take much more than an air trip across the common to do that. And as for the umbrella itself, well, once Tobermory had mended it and cleaned it, he decided to... Well, that is another story altogether.